Josephine Calder made herself two promises the morning she buried her father, and she intended to keep both of them, no matter what the town of Coldwater Junction had to say about a woman running 30 army horses from Greenbrook to Saddle Sound in 6 days. The first promise was that she would finish what Thomas Calder started. The second was that she would not need a single man's help to do it. She was already breaking that second promise by 5:30, though she hadn't admitted it to herself yet. The gray stallion in the round pen had thrown her twice before sunup, and she'd climbed back on twice, because her father's brass stopwatch was open on the fence post, and the watch didn't care how many times a horse put her in the dirt. It only counted the minutes she wasn't using. Josie set her jaw, gathered the lead, and asked the gray to walk out again. He walked. Stiff-legged, ears pinned, but he walked, and she let herself breathe for exactly as long as it took him to decide he hadn't meant it. Behind her, dust rose on the Coldwater Road, a single wagon, moving unhurried, the kind of pace that told her whoever drove it wasn't in any particular trouble and wasn't looking for any either. She didn't have time to wonder about it. She had 29 horses left to get through, and 6 days left to do it in, and a contract with the United States Army that her father had signed, and then had the poor manners to die before delivering. The wagon stopped at the gate around 8, and the man who climbed down from it took his time doing it, the way a man does when his knees have opinions about mornings. He was maybe 30, sun-browned, quiet in his face in a way that wasn't the same as empty. He held a folded paper out to her before he said a word, her own handbill posted 3 days earlier at the mercantile in town, water-stained now from wherever he'd been keeping it.
You're still looking for a hand who knows horses.
It wasn't a question, and Josie didn't treat it like one.
I'm looking for a hand who knows horses and doesn't need explaining to twice. What I've got so far is a stranger reading a handbill off a gate post.
He didn't argue the point. He set the paper down on the top rail, careful, like it mattered to him that it not blow away, and looked past her at the gray stallion still working his temper out in the round pen.
That one's not stiff-legged from being green. He's stiff-legged because somebody's rushing him and he knows it.
She felt her face go hot, because he wasn't wrong, and because she hadn't asked his opinion.
I have 6 days and 29 more of him. Rushing isn't a preference, it's arithmetic.
He considered that a moment, the way another man might consider a card before laying it down.
Then you need someone who can do the arithmetic on 2 horses while you do it on 1. Name's Gideon Marsh. I've broke cavalry remounts for the army before. I don't talk much, and I don't ask for more than a fair wage and a place to sleep that isn't the ground.
Josie looked at him a long moment, at the wagon that held almost nothing, at hands that were scarred in a way that matched hers, at the careful distance he kept from the fence like a man who'd learned not to crowd anything that could kick. She had exactly one way to answer a claim like his, and it wasn't going to be a conversation.
There's a bay gelding in the back pen who hasn't let anyone touch his feet since he came off the trail. Pick up his left front, and we'll talk about wages.
He didn't smile exactly. He just set his hat on the fence post next to her father's stopwatch, climbed through the rail, and walked toward the bay at an angle that told her he already knew where not to stand. 3 minutes later, he was crouched at the gelding's shoulder with the hoof cradled easy against his knee, and the horse standing steady as a fence post, and Josie found she had already stopped watching the watch.
Wage is $1 a day and meals. Bunks in the tack room. It's dry, and I expect you up before I am, which is difficult, because I don't sleep much these days.
He set the hoof down gentle and straightened up, and for the first time something in his face came close to easy.
I don't sleep much either. We'll manage.
She didn't ask him where he'd learned to gentle a horse like that, or why a man with cavalry experience and steady hands was driving a near-empty wagon alone into a county he'd never worked. She had 29 horses in 6 days, and questions she told herself were a luxury she'd sort out later. She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't know it for another 4 days. Colton Rourke arrived at the Calder place 2 hours later, riding a horse considerably finer than anything he needed for a 2-mile visit, and dismounted with the particular ease of a man who had never once doubted he'd be welcome. He found Josie at the corral rail, sleeves pushed up, watching Gideon work a sorrel mare through her first saddle without a lead line. He watched the mare a moment before he watched Josie, and made a point of letting her see him do it. He was sorry, he said, about her father. Thomas Calder had been a decent man who'd let a hard winter get the better of his bookkeeping. Rourke felt it his neighborly duty to remind her of the small matter of the feed debt from 2 winters back. Gently, he said, though there was nothing gentle in the way he said it. $80, plus interest her father had agreed to and never written down where anyone but Rourke could find it.
My father never mentioned owing you $80.
Rourke produced the paper from his coat like he'd been waiting all morning for the chance. Thomas Calder's shaky signature at the bottom of it, dated the winter the hay ran short and half the county's herds nearly starved. He was not, he assured her, in any hurry to collect. The Army contract, he knew as well as she did, was worth a great deal more than $80 if she managed to fill it. He simply thought she ought to know the debt existed, in case delivering 30 horses to Fort Assiniboine in 6 days proved, he chose the word carefully, ambitious. For an outfit with 1 wagon hand nobody in Coldwater Junction had ever laid eyes on before this morning. There was, he added, a simpler solution than arithmetic. He'd said as much to her father once, before the old man's pride got in the way of good sense. The offer still stood, and it didn't require her to break a single more horse to collect on it.
If you're asking whether marrying you strikes me as a simpler solution than a contract I signed with my own hand, Mr. Rourke, I'd rather take my chances with the gray stallion. He at least has the decency to tell me plainly when he means to throw me.
Something moved behind Rourke's eyes that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite amusement, and he folded the paper back into his coat with the patience of a man who has learned that some doors open faster the second time you knock. He'd give her time to reconsider, he said. Debts had a way of coming due at inconvenient hours. He wished her luck with her drifter and rode out at the same unhurried pace he'd ridden in, leaving Josie standing at the rail with considerably more to worry about than she'd woken up with. The Army's advance man arrived that same afternoon, a young corporal named Whitfield with a ledger under his arm and a look on his face that suggested he'd been told to expect a working ranch and had not expected the working ranch to be run by a woman in her father's coat. He counted horses, made his notes, and told her plainly that the terms hadn't changed. 30 horses, 6 days, Lieutenant Foss to inspect on the day the contract named, however many hands she saw fit to put to the work. He wished her good fortune with it and rode out with considerably less ceremony than he'd ridden in. The second visitor of the day arrived an hour behind him, a boy on a borrowed mule, sent from the Larsons spread 2 miles east with regrets instead of the 2 extra hands Josie had arranged weeks earlier. Standard practice at contract time, borrowing labor the way ranchers along Larkspur Creek always had for each other. Family needed the Larson boys at home after all, the messenger said, not quite meeting her eye before he turned back toward the road. Gideon was crossing the yard with a coil of rope over his shoulder when she read the note a second time, then a third, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less convenient for Colton Rourke.
Family needing them home is a strange coincidence. The same week Rourke happened to remind Otto Larson who holds the note on his north pasture. That's not regret. That's arithmetic done on somebody else's behalf.
Man who can't win a woman fair usually finds it easier to starve her of hands than argue with her direct.
She'd grown up watching her own father do that very sum for other men, in the gentler years when the Calders had been the ones with money enough to lean. She hadn't expected to be on the other side of it quite so soon. 30 horses, 6 days, 2 hands where she'd counted on 4. Gideon didn't say much more about it. He just crossed to the corral gate, where Rourke's horse had wrenched the top hinge half off its post storming away that morning. He didn't say anything about the debt, or the deadline, or the offer of marriage Josie hadn't repeated to him and didn't intend to. He just worked the hinge loose, straightened the pin, and set it back true, testing the gate twice before he was satisfied it would hold.
You didn't have to do that tonight.
Gate that doesn't latch is a horse loose by morning. Seemed worth the 10 minutes.
It was such a small thing, a hinge and a pin, and 10 minutes of a man's evening, that Josie almost didn't notice how much steadier she felt watching him do it. Like some part of the ranch, at least, was going to hold together whether or not the rest of it did. If a story like the one Josephine Calder was living deserves to be watched by more than the handful of people who happened to click on it first, tapping the like button is the fastest way to tell YouTube that. It costs you nothing, and it helps this kind of story find the people who'd actually want it. While you're here, tell me what time is it right now, where you're listening from? The next 3 days ate themselves whole, and Josie and Gideon spent most of them within arm's reach of each other without either one commenting on it, because there wasn't time to comment on anything that didn't have 4 legs and a temper. She'd worked alongside her father for 6 years and thought she knew every trick a person could use on a nervous horse. Gideon knew 3 tricks she'd never seen. One was a way of standing at a green horse's shoulder that made him seem to disappear from its notice entirely. Another was a low 2-note whistle that settled a mare mid-spook faster than any hand on the rein. The third was a trick with a cinch that kept a horse from learning to dread the tightening at all. In exchange, she taught him her father's hand signals, small, precise, the kind you could give from 20 feet without a horse ever seeing your face change, built up over a lifetime of working stock too spread out to shout at.
Flat hand, fingers down, that's stand. Flat hand, fingers up, that's walk on. My father used to say, a horse trusts your hands faster than it trusts your voice, because your hands don't know how to lie the way your voice does.
Smart man.
He was, mostly. Not smart enough to write down who he owed money to, apparently.
Gideon didn't answer that, but she caught him watching her a beat too long before he turned back to the horse, and she found she didn't mind it nearly as much as she expected to. By the 3rd evening, they'd gentled 19 of the 30 between them, more than either had quite believed 2 pairs of hands could manage against a job built for 4, and for the first time since her father's funeral, Josie let herself believe the shortfall in hands might not cost her the shortfall in horses. It should have felt like winning. It felt, instead, like the quiet before something worse. They ate supper on the porch that evening, plates balanced on their knees because the kitchen table was still buried under Thomas Calder's account books, and for once there was nothing left needing gentled or counted before dark. Josie found herself talking more than she meant to, the way tiredness sometimes loosens a person past their own good sense. She told him about her mother, dead of a fever when Josie was 12, and how her father had simply kept going afterward the only way he knew, by teaching his daughter everything he would have taught a son, because there wasn't another child left to teach it to, and the horses still needed breaking whether or not the house had a woman's voice in it anymore.
Half the county still thinks I do this because I've got something to prove. Mostly I do it because it's the only language my father and I ever spoke fluently together, and I wasn't ready to stop speaking it just because he did.
Gideon turned his cup in his hands a moment before he answered, the way he did most things, like he wanted to be sure of the shape of it before he set it down.
My uncle ran a remount outfit outside Independence. Raised me after my folks died of the same fever that took half that county one bad summer. Taught me everything Thomas Calder taught you, more or less, except I lost him too. And the Army was the only place still willing to pay a 19-year-old for the one thing he actually knew how to do.
Is that why you never talk about where you're headed after this? You don't have anywhere particular waiting.
Didn't, before this week.
He said it plain, without any weight thrown behind it, and let it sit there instead of chasing it with anything softer. Josie felt the words land somewhere she hadn't given many people access to since her father's funeral, and didn't reach to close that door back up. It was, she'd think later, the last easy evening either of them got for a while. Gideon mentioned, almost in passing, that a man had asked after him in town that afternoon, a stranger buying feed, curious where the new hand at the Calder place had ridden in from. Friendly enough about it that Gideon hadn't thought much of the asking until he tried to sleep and found he was thinking of little else. Neither of them knew yet whose letter east that stranger's questions were meant to answer. They found out 2 days later, on the mercantile porch in front of half the county. The trouble showed itself 2 nights later, in heat lightning that walked the ridge west of the ranch without any rain behind it, close enough that the flashes lit the barn roof white every few seconds, and far enough that the thunder came late, like an afterthought. Josie found Gideon standing in the yard at midnight, not sheltering from it, just watching it, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen on him before, not the calm stillness he wore around horses, but something rigid, held on purpose.
You're not sleeping either.
He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone flatter than she'd heard it.
Storm like this took a man from my old troop, 3 years back, remount corral outside the fort, night just like this one, lightning close enough to spook 200 head at once, no rain to settle the dust so you couldn't see your own hand.
He told it plain, the way a man tells something he's rehearsed alone so many times the words have worn smooth. His captain had put him on first watch that night because he was steadiest with green stock, and a boy named Asa Whitcomb, 17 and proud of his new stripe, had begged to stand it with him.
Herd bolted before I ever saw the strike that spooked them. I got 6 horses turned before they hit the fence line. I didn't get to Asa in time. Board of Inquiry cleared me of fault inside a week. Didn't matter. I still heard him the whole way home, and every man in that troop looked at me like they were doing arithmetic on whether I'd been fast enough.
Josie didn't say she was sorry because sorry felt like the wrong size for what he'd just handed her.
Is that why you don't talk much?
Talking didn't bring him back the first 100 times I tried it on myself. Seemed easier to let my hands do the apologizing instead.
She thought of her own hands raw from 6 days of rope and rain, and understood him a little better than she had an hour before. She didn't reach for him, it wasn't that kind of night yet. But she stood beside him at the fence until the lightning walked on past the ridge, and neither of them was in any hurry to be the first one back inside. Word of what happened at that fort 3 years ago reached Coldwater Junction faster than either of them expected, and it reached it through Colton Rourke, who had written east to an old Army acquaintance the same week Gideon Marsh's name first showed up on Josie Calder's payroll. He chose the mercantile porch to share it on a Saturday morning with half the county present to hear, Corporal Whitfield among them collecting supplies for the fort. Rourke wondered aloud, pleasant as Sunday, whether the Army knew it was trusting 30 government horses to a hand who'd once stood watch the night a troop lost 200 head and a 17-year-old boy along with them. He wondered whether Lieutenant Foss had been told that particular detail, or whether Mrs. Calder, he used the title deliberately, knowing it wasn't hers, preferred to let it stay quiet. Gideon stood at the edge of the porch with a sack of grain on his shoulder and said nothing at all, which was exactly the reaction Rourke had been counting on, and exactly the one that did the most damage. A man who defends himself gives people something to weigh. A man who doesn't gives them nothing but their own imaginations. Josie stepped between them before she decided to.
The Board of Inquiry cleared him. If you've got a letter that says otherwise, Mr. Rourke, I'll read it myself. If all you've got is a story you like better than the truth, I'd rather you kept it off my porch and off my contract.
Rourke allowed with a small, unbothered smile that he had no letter, only a story told to him by a man who'd been there. Stories, he said, had a way of being believed whether or not anyone bothered proving them. He tipped his hat and left it at that, which was worse than if he'd pressed the point, because now the doubt was loose in Coldwater Junction and didn't need him to carry it anymore. Corporal Whitfield's face, when Josie finally made herself look at it, wasn't hostile. It was worried, and that was harder to argue with than hostility would have been. They rode home in a silence that had nothing easy in it, and Josie watched Gideon's hands go tight and loose and tight again on the reins the whole way, like he was fighting the urge to apologize for something that had never once been his fault.
You didn't do anything wrong that night, and you didn't do anything wrong just now either.
Feels the same from inside most days.
She didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud, so she didn't try to manufacture one. Some things, her father used to tell her, you don't talk a person out of, you just make sure they're not carrying it alone. The sky to the west had gone the color of a bruise by the time they reached the gate, dry heat lightening again. Closer this time, close enough that the barn's tin roof lit up gold with every flash, and Josie felt the old unease crawl up her spine before she could name why. 30 horses were on the Calder place that night. 11, gentled far enough already to trust outside 4 walls, stood loose in the covered pen behind the barn. The other 19, the ones still green enough to need a roof between them in a storm, filled every stall the barn had, the gray stallion among them. Still unbroken to anyone's satisfaction but Josie's own, and still worth more to the contract than any 3 of the others combined. Neither of them slept easy that night. It turned out neither of them needed to bother trying. The strike came a little after 2 in the morning, close enough that the crack of it lifted Josie half out of her cot before her mind had finished waking. and by the time she reached the window, the hayloft above the barn's north wall was already burning orange against the dark. There had been no rain all night, only the dry lightning walking the ridge for 2 days straight, and the old hay in that loft had been waiting on a spark since the summer's last cutting. She was running before she'd finished pulling her boots on, and Gideon was already ahead of her, sprinting from the tack room with a horse blanket wrapped around one fist. He was shouting over the crack and roar of burning timber that the stalls had to come open now, every one of them, before the smoke dropped low enough to blind the horses to the door. The next several minutes existed for Josie only in pieces, a latch burning her palm before she thought to wrap her sleeve around her hand, a mare bolting past her shoulder so close the wind of it staggered her, smoke thick enough to taste like a living thing crawling down her throat. Horse after horse went pounding out into the yard and the dark beyond it, and Josie counted them without meaning to, the way she'd counted minutes on her father's stopwatch all week, except now the number that mattered wasn't minutes, it was heads. 19 stalls. She counted 17 horses clear. Somewhere above her the loft gave a long groan, timber surrendering to heat one joint at a time, and sparks came down through the gaps in the boards like the barn itself had started raining fire instead of the sky. The heat pressed against her face hard enough that she had to turn her head to draw breath, and still she went back in, because 2 stalls hadn't emptied yet, and one of them held 30 horses worth of the ranch's whole future. The gray stallion was still inside, pinned by his own panic in the far corner stall, rearing hard enough against the burning rafters that the whole wall shuddered. Past him, further back than any sane person had business being, Gideon was fighting the last latch with his bare hands because the blanket had already caught, and he'd thrown it off rather than let the fire onto his own arm.
Gideon, the roof!
She didn't finish the warning before the beam over the stallion's stall let go. A long groan of old timber giving way all at once, and it came down across the aisle in a shower of burning straw, catching Gideon's leg beneath the smaller end of it and driving him hard to the ground. Josie didn't remember crossing the distance between them. She remembered only the heat of the beam through her sleeves as she threw her weight into it, and the stallion screaming somewhere close and terrible, and Gideon's voice rough with smoke, telling her to get the horse first. Get the horse first. He wasn't going anywhere. She got the horse first. She dragged the stall door wide, slapped the flat of her burned hand hard against the gray's shoulder in the walk-on signal her father had taught her, flat palm, fingers up. For one endless second, the animal simply stared at her through the smoke, as though the signal was the only familiar thing left in a world on fire. Then he bolted past her into the yard, and she turned back for Gideon. The beam hadn't crushed him, a support post had taken most of its weight, but it had him pinned at the shin, and the fire was walking down the collapsed rafters toward them both faster than either of them liked to look at directly. She found the pitchfork where it always hung by the feed bin, jammed the tines under the beam's low end, and threw everything she had left into the handle. It moved an inch, then 2. Gideon dragged his leg free on the 3rd, and together they half ran, half fell out through the barn side door into rain that had finally, uselessly, begun to fall. They lay in the mud at the edge of the yard while the barn's roof went down behind them in a column of sparks. The rain couldn't catch fast enough to matter. Coughing, soaked, Gideon's hand closed hard around her burned one, like he intended to check for himself that it was still attached.
You were supposed to get clear, not come back for the beam.
You went back for the stallion. I don't recall either of us being especially good at following our own rules tonight.
He laughed, one rough, exhausted sound that turned into a cough halfway through, and didn't let go of her hand. They sheltered what remained of the night in the tack room, the one structure close enough to the barn to have caught the worst of the smoke and far enough from the fire itself to have survived it, blankets pulled around them both while the rain finally came down in earnest outside. Gideon's shin was bruised black from ankle to knee but not broken. By some mercy, neither of them examined too closely for fear of jinxing it. Josie's palm was blistered where the latch had burned her, and he wrapped it himself, quiet and careful. The same hands that had gentled 30 horses now doing something considerably gentler.
17 out clean. The gray. You. That's 18 worth more to me tonight than the whole contract.
Contract's not dead. We'll count what's left standing in the morning.
She studied him in the lamplight, soot-streaked, singed at one eyebrow, holding himself together better than any man had a right to after diving twice into a burning building, and thought of the boy named Asa Whitcomb he'd carried 3 years without setting down.
You went back in for a horse that isn't even yours. After a night on that porch where half the county called you the kind of man who lets people die in a fire. That's not nothing, Gideon. That's the opposite of nothing.
A moment passed before he spoke, and there was a rasp in his voice by then that the smoke alone didn't explain.
Wasn't thinking about the county. Wasn't thinking about the boy either, for once. Just thinking I wasn't going to stand outside a burning barn and watch you not come out of it.
The rain kept on outside, steady now, the kind that would have saved the barn if it had come an hour sooner and hadn't come at all. Josie leaned her singed, blistered, exhausted self against his shoulder, and he let her, and for a long moment neither of them reached for anything more than that, too spent, too raw, the night not yet ready to hand them the ending it was building toward. It would have to wait. Morning was coming, and morning was going to want an answer for what remained of the herd. Morning counted the cost in flat daylight, which was crueler than the fire had been, because the fire at least had the decency to hide its damage in smoke. Of the 30 horses under contract, 24 stood in the makeshift rope corral they'd rigged in the yard before dawn, smoke horse, several singed but sound. 6 were gone, 2 bolted clean off the property in the panic, likely miles distant by now, and 4 hadn't made it clear of the stalls at all. 24 wasn't 30. 24, delivered 2 days late because a burned-out barn needed replacing before the horses could be properly finished, was very likely no contract at all. Josie sat on the corral rail with her bandaged hand in her lap and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since sunup, and didn't like any answer it gave her.
I don't see how 24 horses and 2 lost days turns into anything but Rourke getting exactly what he wanted without lifting a finger for it.
Gideon didn't sit down beside her right away. He stood at the rail a moment, working something over, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't the voice of a man offering comfort. It was the voice of a man who'd decided something.
Those 2 that bolted didn't go far. Panicked stock runs until it finds water and stops, and the only water within 5 miles that direction is Larkspur Creek Bend. I can track them and have them back by nightfall. I did exactly that kind of work for 3 years before I did anything else.
It was, Josie realized, the first time she'd heard him offer up his cavalry years as something other than a wound to apologize for.
That still leaves us short and 2 days late.
Not if Foss inspects a barn that burned from a lightning strike neither of us could have stopped, alongside 2 people who went back into it for the stock instead of standing clear and letting the county's story write itself. A man who's actually stood a horse fire knows the difference between neglect and bad luck. I'm gambling Foss has stood one.
He reached into his coat then and drew out a folded water-stained paper of his own, not a handbill this time, but his discharge, the Board of Inquiries finding written plain across the bottom in an army clerk's careful hand, no fault found.
I've carried this 3 years and never once shown it to anybody, because showing it felt like arguing with a boy who isn't here to argue back. I'm done arguing with him. Bring it to Foss with you. Let it say what it says.
She took the paper from him carefully. The way you take something a person has decided, finally, to stop carrying alone, and understood that whatever this was between them, it had stopped being about horses several days back.
Go get the 2 that ran. I'll ride into Coldwater Junction and ask Corporal Whitfield exactly when Lieutenant Foss intends to see for himself what's left of this ranch.
Neither of them said anything about what had almost happened in the tack room the night before. There wasn't time for it yet, and both of them, in their own stubborn way, knew better than to rush a thing worth saying properly. Gideon found the 2 horses' tracks along Larkspur Creek by mid-afternoon, mixed in with fresher sign a band of unbranded mustangs that ranged the bend most autumns, drawn down out of the hills by the last of the season's grass. He followed the tracks another mile before he understood what he was looking at. The Calder mares hadn't been run down or lost at all. They'd simply found company they liked better than a burning barn and fallen in with it. By the time he crested the last rise and saw them grazing easy among the wild band, ears relaxed, he wasn't 1 rope's throw from catching either of them without a fight that would cost more than the horses were worth. He He sat his own horse at the rise a long while, watching them, and found he didn't have the heart to force the matter. A creature that had chosen freedom over a stall it nearly burned inside of seemed, to a man who understood something about wanting to run from what had almost killed him, like the last thing on the ranch that deserved to be dragged back against its will. Josie found him there at dusk, having ridden out from town once Corporal Whitfield told her Lieutenant Foss wouldn't arrive before the following afternoon. She sat her horse beside his at the rise and looked where he was looking. She didn't need him to say it out loud.
You could still rope them. Foss won't ask how hard you tried.
I know. Didn't feel much like making them pay for surviving something that wasn't their fault either.
She thought of the gray stallion, gentled but never quite tamed, and of a man who'd spent 3 years believing he owed a debt to every animal and every soul that had ever trusted him and come up short. Letting 2 mares run free, she was beginning to understand, cost him something different than failure. It cost him practice at forgiving anyone their limits, including his own.
Then we ride back with 24 and let the account books read what they read. My father always said a rancher who can't afford to lose 2 horses to open range has already lost the ranch in every way that matters.
They turned for home together as the light went copper over the ridge, not hurrying, the 2 missing mares grazing easy behind them in country too wide to hold anything against its will for long. Least of all, Josie thought, watching Gideon's quiet profile beside her, a man who'd finally stopped trying to hold himself that way too. Colton Rourke rode into Coldwater Junction that same evening and found the county clerk's office open later than usual. On account of a small favor Rourke had done the clerk's brother the previous winter, the kind of favor men in Rourke's position kept careful ledgers of. He laid Thomas Calder's old feed note on the counter and asked, pleasantly, whether a lien could be perfected against whatever livestock remained on Calder land. Effective immediately, he said, given the fire, given the debt, given what he called, without much effort at sounding sorry about it, a pattern of poor judgment that put government property at unnecessary risk. The clerk hesitated over the paperwork long enough to mention that livestock under a pending Army contract might sit in murkier legal ground than Rourke was suggesting. Rourke assured him the distinction was a technicality, best sorted out by a lieutenant with better things to do than argue county law with a rancher who'd only ever tried to help his neighbors. The clerk signed it anyway. Men usually did, when Rourke asked nicely and reminded them, without quite saying so, of everything he could make considerably less pleasant if they didn't. Lieutenant Foss arrived at the Calder Ranch 2 days later than the original contract allowed and considerably better disposed than Josie had dared hope, having ridden past the blackened skeleton of the barn on his way in and drawn his own conclusions before anyone said a word to him. He was a broad, unhurried man near 50. With the look of someone who had inspected a great many ranches under a great many circumstances and had stopped being impressed by excuses a long time ago, and by proof considerably more recently. Colton Rourke arrived not 10 minutes behind him, uninvited, with a county magistrate's clerk in tow and a folded paper of his own, a lien, hastily drawn, claiming Thomas Calder's old feed debt as grounds to attach whatever stock remained on the property before the Army could take formal delivery of any of it. He explained it to Lieutenant Foss with the same unhurried courtesy he'd used on Josie at the corral rail a week before. It seemed only prudent, he said, given the circumstances, given the fire, given the outfit's rather unusual choice of hired help, for the government to reconsider whether Calder land was the most reliable source for 30 government horses. He didn't look at Gideon when he said unusual choice of hired help. He didn't have to. Gideon stepped forward before Josie could, and for the first time in the week she'd known him, his voice carried all the way across the yard without straining to.
My name is Gideon Marsh. 3 years back, I stood first watch the night lightning spooked 200 head at a remount corral, and a trooper named Asa Whitcomb died in it. The Board of Inquiry cleared me of fault. Here's their finding, in their own hand, if the lieutenant would care to read it rather than take Mr. Rourke's word for what a stranger told him once at a card table.
He held the paper out, steady, and Lieutenant Foss took it, read it slower than the moment strictly required, and looked up at Gideon with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't far from it. He'd stood a stampede himself, he said, and read 100 inquiries since. Cleared was cleared. He didn't need Mr. Rourke's card table version of that night when he had the Army's own hand telling him otherwise. He turned the same unhurried attention on Rourke's lien next, and it lasted considerably less time. That debt was against the late Thomas Calder, he said, personally signed, personally owed, and not a claim against government-contracted livestock. Rourke knew that as well as he did, or he'd have filed it with the county 8 days ago, instead of the same morning the lieutenant rode in to inspect delivery. He was welcome to take it up with the estate through proper channels if he believed it was owed. Foss, for his part, had 24 sound horses to count and a barn fire that 2 people had run into instead of away from, and frankly that told him more about who he was dealing with than either paper did. Rourke's composure held, barely, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. He said he trusted the lieutenant's judgment, gathered his clerk, and rode out for the last time. Though nobody said so aloud, everyone in that yard understood it. Foss counted the 24 horses himself, tested a dozen at random under saddle, and pronounced them, gruffly, some of the soundest remounts he'd taken delivery of in a decade, fire, lost barn and all. He'd note the circumstances in his report, he said, and the contract, minus fair adjustment for the 6 horses lost, would stand. It was near dusk by the time Lieutenant Foss's escort rode out with the horses strung behind them, and the yard went quiet in the particular way a place goes quiet after it has spent a week holding its breath. Josie stood at the rail where the round pen used to sit before it burned, her father's stopwatch retrieved, soot-blackened but still ticking, from the wreckage that morning closed in her uninjured hand, and found she had nothing left to time. Foss had settled what the army owed that same afternoon, cash enough for a drifter to make a clean start somewhere warmer before the snow came. Nothing signed anywhere said Gideon owed her a single day past the 6 he'd already worked. She watched the road instead of the barn for a while, bracing the way she'd learned to brace for a green horse's first real test, not hoping too hard, in case hoping made the disappointment worse if she was wrong about him. Gideon crossed the yard to stand beside her instead, favoring the leg the beam had bruised, and neither of them reached for a chore to hide behind this time.
Contracts delivered. Barn's gone. County knows the truth about that night, whether Rourke likes it or not. I believe that's every promise either of us was keeping accounts on.
Not quite everyone.
She turned the stopwatch over in her palm, the glass cracked but the hands still moving, and held it out to him, not as payment, not as a wage, but as the kind of thing you hand someone when you've decided they're not leaving with the wagon they arrived in.
My father used to say his hands never lied to him the way his voice sometimes did. I've been counting minutes on this watch my whole life, waiting to know when something was finished. I don't need it to tell me that anymore.
Gideon took it slow, the way he took hold of anything worth being careful with, and closed his hand around hers instead of the watch alone.
I told you once I let my hands do the apologizing instead of my voice. Feels like it's about time my voice caught up.
He didn't make a long speech of it, because that was never going to be who he was, and she wouldn't have wanted it from him if it had been. But he took his time getting the words lined up, the way he'd once lined up a coil of rope before a throw he couldn't afford to miss. He said plainly that he loved her, that he hadn't expected to survive a burning barn and come out the other side of it certain of anything, but he was certain of that. And she said it back before he'd finished the last word of it, because 6 days of watching a man's hands tell the truth had taught her to stop waiting on speeches. The kiss that followed wasn't hurried, and it wasn't careful either. It was the kind 2 people allow themselves only after they've both nearly lost everything worth kissing anyone about, out in a yard that smelled of rain and ash and faintly underneath it, of something finally quietly beginning. They rebuilt the barn before the first snow, with lumber Gideon hauled from Coldwater Junction and hands from half the ranches nearby who'd heard. By then, the true account of what happened the night lightning found that old hayloft. Otto Larson was among them, his 2 boys working the far wall without much talk, the kind of apology a proud man pays in labor because he can't quite pay it in words. Josie let him. A man leaned on wasn't the same as a man who leaned easy, and she'd learned that difference well enough not to hold the rest against him. Even Colton Rourke paid a visit in his way, a wagon load of milled boards left at the gate without a word, gone again before anyone could thank him for it. Some debts, it turned out, ran in more than one direction. I think about that stopwatch sometimes, cracked glass, hands still moving, handed from a father's grip into a stranger's, and somehow becoming, along the way, something neither of them had a word for yet. I think most of us have owned something like it, not a watch, maybe. A thing we clung to because letting go of it felt like admitting the counting was over. Has someone ever proven to you plainly, with what they did rather than what they said, that you could finally stop counting the minutes? I'd like to hear about it if you're willing to share it down in the comments. I have a feeling I'm not the only one listening who remembers a night like that.